Welcome, listeners. Before the horrors start, please take a moment to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments your location and the current hour. Your vital participation guarantees these scary tales will keep haunting your feed. Now we enter the night. My name is Daniel, and this event occurred last December when I was living completely alone in my home for an entire week. My partner had traveled to stay with her family for the holiday season, and I remained behind due to my demanding work schedule. I reside in a secluded neighborhood within a small settlement in upstate New York. The homes are quite separated, and most of the residents on my street travel elsewhere for Christmas. Consequently, I essentially had the whole road to myself. Initially, I quite liked the prospect of the tranquility and silence. I imagined I would finally get ample rest, perhaps catch up on recorded programs, and just savor the festive warmth for a while. However, what transpired that week remains deeply embedded in my memory. It was on the second night of my solitude. The time was roughly 6:30, and the outside was already pitch black. Snow had been falling gently throughout the day, leaving a white layer covering my lawn and driveway. I was inside the kitchen preparing a simple supper, just pasta and chicken. Typically, my girlfriend handles the cooking for our meals. I'm not much of a cook. I switched on the television in the background to make the residents feel less deserted, because despite enjoying the space to myself temporarily, I wasn't accustomed to it being so empty and quiet in here. While I was eating at the kitchen table, I perceived an unusual sound. It truly took me a moment to grasp what I was hearing. It seemed like someone was singing. I quickly muted the TV and focused my attention. The sound was definitely emanating from outdoors. The singing became slightly clearer, and I realized the individual was performing Jingle Bells. At first, I assumed maybe some local kids were messing around outside, but the voice didn't resemble that of a child. It sounded like an adult male. I rose and moved toward the main entrance, as that appeared to be the source of the noise. The closer I got, the louder it became. By the time I reached the door, the singing sounded like it was coming from right on my front porch. I felt a strange knot in my stomach, but at that specific moment, I still thought perhaps it was just a Christmas caroler. I opened the door, and illuminated by the glow of my porch lamp was a man, appearing to be around 35 years old. He wore no cap, and his overcoat looked far too light for the freezing conditions. But the most unsettling thing was that he was entirely focused on singing Jingle Bells, gazing down at my welcome mat as if he hadn't even noticed I had opened the door. I remember forcing a small, strained smile because I honestly didn't know how else to react. I had never received Christmas carolers before, but even then, I had certainly never heard of a grown man doing it by himself. It's meant to be a group activity, from what I understood. He didn't look threatening. In fact, he just looked somewhat perplexed, or maybe mentally slow. I even speculated if he might have special needs or something, as he didn't react to my presence. He simply continued his song. When he completed the tune, I expected him to speak, or at least depart. Instead, he just took a deep breath and started singing Jingle Bells all over again from the beginning, in the same dragging, slightly off-key manner. But now he was looking up at me, locking direct eye contact. I felt my smile vanish, because the situation was simply bizarre. I stood there for another full minute, pretending to listen, even though it felt completely uncomfortable. I kept expecting him to stop after the second repetition, but he didn't. He just kept looping the song. I checked my cell phone and realized almost 4 minutes had elapsed while he sang Jingle Bells repeatedly. Finally, I determined enough was enough. I thanked him using a polite tone, and then I slowly closed the door. I assumed that action would prompt him to leave, but once the door was fully shut, I could still hear the singing. It persisted without even slowing its pace. I returned to the table and took my seat, attempting to disregard it, but the longer it continued, the harder it became to ignore. The man didn't seem right, and it troubled me that he was still directly outside my door, singing the same song. I wondered if perhaps he was special needs and someone was nearby with him, maybe by the edge of the street, but I didn't see anyone else out there. It made the whole house feel unsettling, as if a strange person was invading my personal space. I kept eating, but I couldn't concentrate on the meal. This went on for the entirety of my dinner. Eventually, After approximately 10 minutes straight, the singing abruptly ceased. The sudden silence actually made me jump, because I had become accustomed to the noise. I stood up slowly and walked back to the window beside the front door. When I looked outside, I expected to see the man gone, but he was still there. He had changed position. Now he was standing at the far end of my driveway. He was simply facing my house, completely motionless. He was no longer singing. At least, I couldn't hear anything from this distance. He was just standing there in the fallen snow, staring straight at the door. Something about that felt significantly worse than the singing. He looked like he was waiting for something. I cracked the door open and firmly told him he couldn't stay here, that this was private property, and he absolutely needed to leave. He didn't move a muscle. The entire occurrence felt so deeply unnatural. I ultimately warned him that if he didn't depart, I would call the police immediately. Then I quickly shut the door once more. I watched him for another minute through the window, but he did not budge. I didn't actually want to call the police because I thought maybe he had a mental illness, and I didn't want to escalate the situation unnecessarily. So instead, I chose to just go upstairs, lock my bedroom door, and try to calm down. I checked the upstairs window before changing into my night clothes. The man was gone from the driveway. Thank goodness. I figured the threat of the police must have worked. I climbed into bed, turned on a bedside lamp, and began reading my novel to relax. Perhaps 20 minutes went by when I heard a noise from the back of the house. I instantly recognized what it was. Unluckily, it was the very same man singing Jingle Bells again, except this time it was coming from my backyard. I leaped out of bed and rushed to the back window. When I looked down, he was not only directly inside my backyard, he was already looking straight up at my window. The man was in my yard, standing in the snow directly below my bedroom window. He was staring right up at me while he sang. I slid open the window and shouted at him that I was calling the police right now. The singing stopped immediately. He stood there in total silence for about 3 seconds. Then he suddenly exploded into a full-speed sprint toward the back door on the lower level. The second he disappeared from my view, I heard the most terrifying sound I've ever experienced in my whole life. He started screaming at the very top of his lungs. Not like a typical scream. It sounded like a death metal vocalist, but even more deranged and out of control. It echoed across the yard and resonated throughout the whole house. Then came the violent impacts. The back door shook violently as he kicked it hard, slammed into it repeatedly, and was likely trying to wrench the doorknob off. I felt the powerful vibrations from the forceful impacts even up here in my upstairs bedroom. I realized this individual wasn't just weird. He was attempting to gain entry into my home. I snatched my phone and dialed 911 right away. I begged the dispatcher to hurry, telling them a man was actively trying to break in. I stayed on the line while clutching a baseball bat tightly with my other hand. I backed into my bedroom closet and sealed myself inside. The operator instructed me to remain hidden and quiet. I could still clearly hear the horrific screams and violent bangs from downstairs, and every second felt like he was about to burst through. Then, just as abruptly as they began, the banging sound stopped. Everything fell silent except for my own panicked breathing. I had no way of knowing if he had left the property or if he had managed to get inside. I stayed absolutely still inside the closet until the police eventually arrived. They checked the entire perimeter of the house and confirmed the back door was still securely locked. The operator on the phone told me it was safe to come out and meet the officers. When I stepped outside to greet them, I finally felt like I could breathe properly again. We walked around the backyard and saw deep footprints pressed into the snow, showing exactly where he had stood while singing up to me through the window and where he had sprinted toward the back door. The footprints then led off into the dense woods directly behind my property. The police attempted to follow the trail for a short distance, but came back because it apparently wasn't worth venturing deep into the forest at night. They acted like it wasn't a significant event. They told me people behave strangely all the time, and that as long as I kept my doors securely locked, I should be perfectly fine. They didn't seem very concerned about finding him, and that deeply bothered me. But I was too rattled to argue with them. After they departed, the house felt horribly empty and intensely cold. I kept every single door and window locked and double-checked them repeatedly. At that point, I was completely over the alone time and just desperately wanted my girlfriend back home. I went down to my parents' house for Christmas Eve and Christmas Day. Fortunately, as for that strange man, he never came back. At least not that I'm aware of. This narrative centers on my experience during the Christmas season approximately a decade ago. I was 6 years old, having recently turned that age in November, and had just concluded my birthday festivities. We were now preparing for the year-end holidays. My birthday celebration occurred on the same day as the famous Odell Beckham Jr.'s spectacular catch. I lived among staunch Cowboys supporters, yet I rooted for the Giants. I clearly recall the talk about it dominating the rest of the evening, and even continuing during my birthday gathering. It was quite an eventful week for my birthday. I find it surprising that I retain such vivid memories of all this, considering I was only 6. I didn't comprehend the sport of football, but I certainly grasped that the reception was insane. So, I was simply enjoying the moment, thrilled it was my birthday, just like any child. For my birthday present, I received tickets to the Dallas Mavericks versus Washington Wizards NBA game, scheduled for December 30th. I was a fan of the Cavaliers, but since we resided in the DFW area, outside of Dallas, I knew many Mavs supporters, and I held a small affinity for them myself. So I was pleased. This was set to be my very first professional basketball game. Christmas Day arrived 5 days earlier, and I received a brand new Odell Beckham Jr. jersey, along with a Mavericks t-shirt and sweatshirt, as I was quickly becoming a serious sports enthusiast. I had a wonderful Christmas, but one of my gifts was an additional Mavs game, which was on December 27th, against the Oklahoma City Thunder. I was incredibly excited about attending both matches. The day arrived, and we attended the game. The Mavericks secured a tight victory, scoring something like 112-105. Witnessing an event of that magnitude inside an NBA arena for the first time was an electrifying experience. We departed the facility and drove home, which was maybe 45 minutes away from the American Airlines Center. The following couple of days passed normally, but I was eagerly anticipating returning to that incredible stadium and vibrant atmosphere. This second time, we went again. Little did I know it would be my final visit for many years. At the previous game, we had great seating, about 7 rows from the court and centered, but this time we were perhaps row 20 and in a corner section, so the viewing experience was noticeably different. The game was progressing well, and I was thoroughly enjoying it. The Mavericks were annihilating their opponents by roughly 20 to 30 points at the half. Since I was a young child, I wanted to wander around, purchase snacks, and use the restroom independently, but I was with my parents and only 6 years old. Consequently, my parents and I walked together to get some food. We waited in line for perhaps 20 minutes. My father went to a different concession stand within the arena to obtain other food options, and I remained with my older brother, who was waiting in the queue to complete the purchase. As my brother spoke with the attendant, I wandered away to dispose of some candy wrappers they had purchased for me before the game. I walked toward a refuse bin situated about 30 feet away. As I reached it, this tall, pale man approached me and inquired, "Hello, are you lost, young man?" I shook my head silently, not speaking a word. He mentioned he didn't spot my parents nearby and instructed me, "Let's go search." As he took my hand and walked alongside me, I was merely a child, so I proceeded with him. He escorted me toward the upper levels, the nosebleeds, and stated we were heading to the main intercom so they could broadcast my name and locate my parents. I agreed and kept walking. We reached the top level and waited for around 10 minutes. He waited until the area was completely deserted and then attempted to push me toward the emergency stairwell or an elevator. I don't recall precisely, but I definitely remember the vicinity being empty. Then, I suddenly remembered the concept of stranger danger, and the feelings of dread and anxiety began to overwhelm me. I realized I should not be following this man. He carried no official credentials. When he released my hand to quickly check his phone, I bolted and ran all the way back toward the lower seating stands. As I fled, I glanced back and saw him standing there with a subtle smirk on his face. I couldn't immediately find my parents, but I didn't care. I just needed to be somewhere safe. I eventually found my brother, who had not yet informed my parents that I had disappeared because he feared getting into trouble. He asked if I was all right, and I responded yes, deliberately choosing not to mention anything. The game ended, and the Mavericks won, but I was indifferent. I just wanted to return home. As we were exiting, I was very quiet. When we got into the car, I was also silent. My parents appeared puzzled by my lack of energy, but I told them I was simply fatigued. As we drove toward home, I nearly dozed off, but then a very loud horn blared and tires screeched behind us. It was so piercing I almost yelled. I quickly turned around, and there he was, the same man operating a pickup truck, with perhaps 3 other males inside. I couldn't distinguish their faces, only dark outlines. My parents shouted at them from inside our vehicle when they pulled up next to us, but the men just stared blankly. I desperately wanted to speak up, but for some reason I couldn't. Once we arrived home, I went straight to bed and fell asleep very quickly. In the middle of the night, I woke up with a feeling of profound coldness. I noticed a light flashing against my window. I looked outside, expecting something harmless, perhaps Santa Claus or something similar, but instead, I saw that man standing out there, directing a flashlight beam right into my bedroom window. I screamed and rushed into my parents' room, telling them someone was at my window, as if it were a ground floor opening. They hurried outside and searched the property for approximately 20 minutes. They failed to locate anything, and since I was a child, they were skeptical of my account. They suggested it must have been a shadow cast by a passing car, but I know unequivocally what I witnessed. On New Year's Eve, a couple of days later, we were staying up until midnight to watch the Times Square ball drop. We were about 5 or 6 minutes away from the countdown when the doorbell chimed. My parents went to answer it. I wasn't paying attention until I distinctly heard the man's voice, and I was 100% certain it was him. I informed my parents, but they dismissed my claim. I told them about the incident at the game, how he took me to the high level, and I ran away and escaped, but they still didn't believe me. They explained it was just a man handing out flyers for his cousin's lost dog. The night continued, and I calmed down. However, exactly 1 year later on New Year's Eve, there was a quiet tapping at my bedroom window. Keep in mind, I had almost forgotten about the entire frightening situation. I got out of bed and looked, and there was a folded piece of paper affixed to the glass that read, "This New Year, you'll meet me again." I gave the note to my parents, and they filed a police report, but they never heard back about any progress. Every few years, I become terrified around New Year's Eve, thinking that disturbing man will return. I told my parents I never want to attend an NBA game again, claiming it simply wasn't my favorite thing. But now I'm 16, and the fact that the man knows where I live truly scares me. I'm thinking about attending the Cavaliers versus Mavericks game on January 2nd or 3rd, which would be my first basketball game since that event, but I remain unsure. This experience frightened me away from the sport and made me obsessively close my curtains every night. I remember this entire night far too clearly, and even today, I reflect on how close my family came to something genuinely catastrophic. It was early in December, and we made the decision to drive northward into the hills to chop down an authentic Christmas tree. This was something my wife, Mary Ann, and I had always wished to experience. Furthermore, our 7-year-old son, Andrew, was also thrilled about the trip. The weather was frigid and overcast, and the sky held that oppressive quality, suggesting fresh snow could resume, falling at any moment. For us, this atmosphere intensified the holiday mood. The entire drive up the twisting mountain roads made me feel youthful again. It had been a considerable time since I'd engaged in such a unique and Christmas-spirited activity, and witnessing Andrew's excitement simply transported me back to my own youth. When we eventually arrived at the secluded location Mary Ann had discovered online, there were no other vehicles present in the designated parking area. There were several light fixtures positioned around, so we weren't in absolute darkness, if you were concerned. That's precisely why we selected this spot. Still, we had brought along 3 flashlights. We parked near a small, unmarked trail that wound further into the woods. There was still a deep covering of snow on the ground from the heavy snowfall we received a few days prior, and being this high up, the the snow took much longer to thaw. Andrew immediately leaped out of the car and began tossing snowballs at us. Naturally, I started throwing them back. We were here to enjoy ourselves, so of course, I intended to make the memory as special as possible for Andrew. I grabbed our illumination devices and the axe that I planned to use for felling a suitable tree. We proceeded up the narrow path, the snow crunching loudly beneath our boots. Andrew kept dashing ahead, pausing to gesture at pines he thought might be the perfect specimen. The deeper we ventured, the more the road behind us vanished, and the only illumination came from the faint moonlight attempting to pierce the dense cloud cover. It was so quiet that I actually requested Mary Ann and Andrew to stop briefly, just to truly absorb the stillness. There was not a single sound, perhaps a gentle gust of wind, but nothing else. To be truthful, had I been there alone, I would have been slightly unnerved by the sheer silence and darkness alone. As we walked further along the path, we had to rely on the flashlights we brought. All three of us needed one. Andrew was having immense fun with his light until the illumination from the parking lot was no longer perceptible, and it was now essentially complete darkness outside of our flashlights. He began to grow visibly uneasy as he asked how much further we intended to walk and commented on the intensity of the darkness. I kept having the sensation that someone was observing us, or that something was tracking behind us. But each time I quickly turned around, there was nothing but the vacant, snowy trail. After about 10 minutes of walking, we finally located an area where the trees were tall and very full. Andrew ran circles around them, diligently searching for the best one. Mary Ann remained closer to me and murmured that she wanted to select a tree quickly because she was experiencing a strange apprehension too. I understood exactly what she meant. This setting was far more unsettling than I had anticipated. Just then, I heard a soft crunching noise in the snow behind us. It wasn't caused by any of us, nor did it sound like an animal. It sounded like heavy boots pressing the snow, but moving very slowly, almost stealthily. When I spun around, I observed a man in dark attire, standing roughly 20 feet back on the path. He was improperly dressed for the weather. His hands were exposed and crimson from the cold. His coat looked more like a thin windbreaker garment. His face appeared pale and rigid, as if he had endured the cold for an excessively long time. Mary Ann instantly grabbed Andrew's arm, pulling him in close. When the man realized we were looking directly at him, he abruptly smiled in a peculiar, unsettling manner and took a step closer. He inquired if we were searching for a Christmas tree. His voice, interrupting the already tense silence, was jarring. His voice was deep-toned and rather soft. Before I could formulate a reply, Andrew excitedly answered yes, becoming cheerful again. I felt a surge of panic, because I absolutely did not want this man to know anything about our intentions. Mary Ann quickly interjected, telling him no, that we were merely taking a hike. The man stepped nearer again, and the way he moved caused every hair on my arms to stand upright. He informed us not to worry, because he was definitely not a park ranger. He said this as if he could perfectly discern precisely why we had lied, because admittedly, what we were doing was certainly unauthorized. I wanted to end the conversation entirely. Something was clearly wrong with this person. He looked famished or desperate, or perhaps like he hadn't slept in several days. I suppose, for lack of a better term, he looked destitute. I told Mary Ann we should immediately return to the car, and she nodded, tightening her grip on Andrew's jacket. When we began walking past the man, he remained standing there, still smiling and watching, offering slight nods as if saying goodbye as we moved. Andrew kept peering back, asking if the man was following, and we instructed him to keep facing forward. Every time I glanced over my shoulder, the man was marginally closer than he had been moments before, even though I hadn't heard him accelerate his pace. I whispered to Mary Ann that once we reached the main parking area, we needed to run immediately to the truck. She held Andrew's hand even more tightly and nodded without looking back. The man's footsteps remained behind us the entire duration, dragging slightly, as if his boots were either too large or too heavy. Once we were close enough to perceive the gap in the trees, where our vehicle was situated, I told them to run. Mary Ann scooped up Andrew and ran as fast as she possibly could. The only reason I felt even remotely secure was because of the axe gripped in my hand, but I am not a violent individual, and I've never had to resort to physical force in my entire life. I quickly spun around to block the path behind us, if only for a second. The man had stopped walking and was just staring intently at me, raising his hand slightly in a non-threatening gesture, still smiling. And then he spoke. I mean no actual harm. Why don't you get back to your truck now? I felt my heartbeat momentarily seize as he uttered that sentence. He said truck as though he knew definitively we had arrived in a pickup truck. I replied simply that we didn't want any trouble at all. Then I turned and began hurrying back down toward the lot. But halfway there, Marianne suddenly screamed my name, sounding utterly panicked. Oh no, I thought immediately. When I reached the truck, she showed me that both tires on the right side had been punctured. I didn't need to examine the damage for long to realize he was responsible. I instructed Marianne to dial 911 immediately, but she initially struggled to obtain cell service. She walked around the snow-covered lot for a little while until she found reception. She never strayed too far away from the vehicle. I had Andrew wait inside the truck. He was now clearly distressed as he watched Marianne and me frantically reacting. He was old enough to know something serious was happening. Marianne seemed to be having difficulty relaying information on the call, so I took the phone and precisely explained our current location and that we felt threatened by a random man in the woods who may have potentially been responsible for flattening our tires. Given the potentially unstable individual in the proximity and the fact that we had a child with us, the police were treating this very seriously and ordered me to keep my family securely locked in the truck until officers arrived and that a tow truck would be dispatched as well. I was told to keep the operator on the line while we waited, but soon the connection began getting choppy, cutting out intermittently because of the poor signal quality. Then Marianne suddenly shrieked into my ear to look and pointed toward the tree line near the path we had been following. There were multiple people standing just beyond the edge of the trees. I counted at least 3 figures. They looked like mere dark shadows from where we stood, which made the sight even more terrifying. It was exactly like we were being stalked and actively hunted. Then 2 of the people started walking slowly closer. I told the emergency operator, and she said something that truly made me uncomfortable. She asked if I possessed any kind of defensive weapons, and when I confirmed I had the axe, she implied that if the situation escalated, I should utilize it to defend my family. By this time, Andrew was crying intensely, and Marianne struggled to soothe him. I informed the operator that 2 of the figures were still advancing toward the truck. They weren't running or shouting or displaying aggression. They just walked very deliberately, as if they knew we couldn't possibly escape. The 3rd figure strangely disappeared, likely retreating deeper into the woods away from the light. The operator told me the police were close, but I had no idea if that meant 2 minutes or 10. I kept alternating my gaze between the tree line and the road in the distance, desperately praying to see flashing lights. I attempted to speak to the operator again, but the call disconnected completely. The instant the line cut off, everything felt 100 times more perilous. I locked the doors again, despite them already being secured. I kept my hand firmly on the axe, gripping it so hard my knuckles turned white. As the 2 people were now within audible range, we could distinctly hear them calling out, "We're here to help you," while they waved their hands in the air. We didn't recognize either of them as being the initial man from earlier. "Do you think they are genuine park rangers?" Marianne hesitantly asked, and I stated firmly, "Not a chance." But perhaps I said it too loudly, because Andrew immediately started weeping even harder, which Marianne had to try exceptionally hard to comfort him through. These 2 approaching people were dressed similarly to that first guy, meaning severely underdressed, and their clothing looked worn out, almost dirty, and they seemed completely unaffected by the bitter cold. But then, quite randomly, the 2 of them wheeled around and began sprinting back in the direction from which they had arrived. We didn't immediately grasp the reason why, but the explanation soon became evident. Never have we been so profoundly overjoyed to hear the distinct sound of police sirens. The noise was rapidly growing louder, and eventually, we saw the flashing blue and red lights approaching from down the main road. They were driving quite fast, actually. The police SUV entered the lot with its powerful spotlight illuminated, and it instantly shone directly in our direction. I flashed my own headlights rapidly to try to get the officer in the patrol car to notice the men fleeing back into the woods. At this juncture, however, they were already nearly gone, but their footprints were left clearly visible. Once the SUV pulled up beside us, 2 officers immediately jumped out with flashlights drawn, and I got out, essentially falling to my knees, thanking them profusely. I gestured in the direction the men had fled. I said they disappeared into the trees, as if they had pre-planned their escape route. The police told us to remain inside the truck while they conducted a search, and more units showed up within minutes. 1 officer remained stationed with us. Andrew was no longer frightened, but instead, once again excited by the commotion and the sight of police officers. After an extended search, the police returned and told us what I already knew they were going to say. They hadn't located anyone. Only deep tracks in the snow that led far into the woods and eventually branched off in multiple directions. They couldn't determine if the people resided somewhere out there, or if they were part of some kind of transient camp deeper in the mountains. They explained that sometimes vagrants or squatters stay concealed in remote areas throughout the winter. The tow truck eventually arrived, and the police stayed surrounding us the entire time until our truck was securely loaded onto the flatbed. We were required to sit in the back of a patrol car to remain warm while they finalized everything. No one spoke much at all. Marianne held Andrew in her lap, and I just stared out the window, watching the dark boundary of the trees, half expecting to see someone standing there again. On the trip heading back home, none of us exchanged words. It was as if all of us were terrified that articulating anything out loud would somehow make the whole ordeal real again. We never attempted to cut down a Christmas tree ever again. We didn't even go back to that specific mountain region. Even now, a decade later, I absolutely refuse to venture anywhere near it. To this very day, what terrifies me the most is the chilling thought that they had been observing us long before we ever noticed their presence. They watched us arrive in that parking lot because they knew precisely how to strand us by slashing my tires, and they were patiently waiting for us to travel deep enough into the trees so that we couldn't possibly make it back to the safety of the truck. We were incredibly fortunate that we trusted our gut instinct sufficiently and made the decision to rush back to the truck almost immediately. We were also lucky I was holding an axe, which may have deterred them from attempting something truly insane. I hate thinking about how close we came to potentially never returning home. I frequently reflect on this particular evening from when I was 9 years old. It occurred just a few days before Christmas. My parents both had commitments that night, and since I was approaching 9, they felt comfortable leaving me home by myself for a brief period. My mother needed to quickly visit the supermarket to purchase some items for the holiday dinner, and my father was working late, as he typically did in December. I was relaxing on the sofa, probably watching a festive film and eating cookies beside the illuminated tree and fireplace. Outside, darkness had already settled, even though the hour was still relatively early. I remember observing the blinking Christmas lights decorating the residences across the road. Everything felt normal until the front doorbell rang. The only reason this made me pause and look up was because it was quite late and a random time for someone to ring the bell. Plus, my mother had always instructed me never to answer the door when I was by myself. My parents never rang the bell, of course, since they possessed keys. I got up and walked toward the entrance anyway because I felt compelled to peek through the peephole. When I placed my eye against it, I saw a man standing on the porch wearing a Santa Claus outfit. It was the complete ensemble, too. The crimson coat, the matching cap, the white beard, the works. However, he did not resemble a normal, friendly Santa figure. He wasn't carrying anything except what appeared to be a clipboard, and he was standing uncomfortably close to the door, as if anticipating that I would immediately unlock it. I didn't know what to say initially, so I just whispered, "Who is it?" The man tilted his head slightly closer to the door, seeming to try to peer through the peephole or hear me more clearly. In that very instant, he realized immediately that the person inside was a child. He then attempted what I assume was his most convincing Santa impersonation, stating he was Santa and had special gifts for me, and that I should swiftly open the door. At 9 years old, I wasn't naive, and I no longer believed in Santa Claus. My parents had educated me thoroughly about strangers. I commanded him to depart and firmly said I didn't require anything, trying to sound courageous, but my voice clearly wavered. The man went quiet for a moment, and then he asked me if I was home alone. As soon as he posed that question, I knew I had to retreat. I instantly regretted even letting him know I was present. I didn't respond to him. I quickly backed away from the entrance and hurried toward the living room, because I suddenly felt too afraid to remain near the door. I sat on the couch, hugged a cushion, and stared at the television, hoping that acting normal would somehow make the fear vanish. But then I heard the doorknob on the front door twist. He was deliberately checking if the door was securely locked. I wanted desperately to scream for help, but there was no one else in the house. I waited, praying that he would leave the premises. A moment later, though, I heard another distinct sound originating from the rear of the house. It was the back door handle being attempted, not twisting. This occurred so quickly after the front door that I'm certain he had sprinted around the structure to the back. That particular door was even less sturdy than the main one, and we hardly ever used it. I felt completely paralyzed, and all I could focus on was the fact that my house only had 2 entrances, and this man was systematically trying both. I ran into the kitchen, grabbed the telephone, and hastily dialed my mother's number. When she answered, I began speaking very rapidly, trying desperately not to burst into tears. I informed her that someone was attempting to break into the house, and that he was dressed like Santa. My mother became serious instantly and told me she was rushing home right away and that I should not open any doors under any circumstances. She ordered me to stay in the living room and keep all the curtains drawn. I crouched on the floor behind the sofa, where I couldn't be viewed from any windows, and I remained absolutely motionless. I kept hearing faint noises outside, like quiet footsteps or gentle tapping sounds, subtle indications that someone was still lurking nearby. Eventually, the sound ceased, and not long after, I heard a car pulling into our driveway. I knew it was my mother because I recognized the sound of her squeaky brakes. I stayed exactly where I was until I heard the distinct sound of the front door unlocking and then slamming wide open. My mother rushed in, breathing heavily and still clutching 2 grocery bags. She immediately locked the door behind her and shouted my name, and I ran straight into her embrace. She hugged me tightly and then revealed that she had just seen a man dressed as Santa walking down our street. She said she slowed her car when she spotted him and yelled at him from a window, asking what exactly he was doing. The man told her he was going door to door soliciting charitable donations, but she didn't believe him for a second. She said he appeared extremely nervous and that he walked away quickly when she started yelling. My mother told me she was proud of me for refusing to open the door and for telephoning her immediately. She contacted the police and reported the suspicious man, and I am confident that the police at least monitored the area afterward. We never discovered if he was apprehended or if he simply vanished into the neighborhood. 2 neighbors did confirm, however, that the man knocked on their doors requesting contributions, although they mentioned it felt like a fraudulent scheme. Regardless, that fact doesn't change that he tried to forcibly enter our house, where he knew a small boy was home alone. I still think about that night every year around the Christmas season when I see Santa decorations. I just remember being 9 years old and knowing that strange man on our porch was certainly not Santa, and that he desired something else entirely. I suppose I was extremely fortunate that the doors were securely locked and that my mother returned precisely when she did. What would have happened if that door had been left unlocked is a truly terrifying thought.